So let's pose a question for now. If tyranny in the 21st century, well, if it looks less like tanks rolling down the street and more like the quiet consent we give every day, does this book offer real tools for resistance?
Or is it just ringing partisan alarm bells?
We believe that some books must be challenged, especially when the stakes are this high. Our mission in this deep dive is a step-by-step critical analysis. We map the book's claims against evidence, we apply ethical tests like the Golden Rule.
And the U.S. preamble.
Right, and we conclude with a logical analysis to give you a really balanced assessment of its use in the real world. We're not here to debate politics, but to scrutinize the argument itself.
And the book we're scrutinizing is Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. It's this incredibly compact, potent civic manual.
It really is.
It gives you 20 stark lessons that are distilled directly from the rise of, well, the worst totalitarian dictatorships, Nazism, Stalinism, those regimes.
These aren't just academic theories, are they? They're presented as survival guides.
Exactly. And Snyder is aiming them squarely at citizens in modern stressed democracies. He's especially looking at the United States, warning that the same mechanisms of collapse are still very much on the table today.
So what is that central claim we're really digging into here?
The core claim is profoundly urgent. It's that democratic collapse isn't inevitable, but it becomes dangerously likely the moment citizens just stop participating.
Abdicate their role.
Yes. When people stop defending institutions, stop demanding truth, and fail to protect one another, that's when the vulnerability just skyrockets. The book's whole premise is that your personal choices are the final firewall.
And before we dive in, we just want to mention that you're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. It's powered by Google's Notebook, LM, and it's designed for a deeper, more dynamic book critique. Okay, so let's unpack the argument's architecture. Snyder builds his case on a pretty simple four-move skeleton. The first move is just establishing historical reality.
Which is that modern democracies are fragile.
Very fragile. And no nation, no matter how wealthy or stable it seems, is automatically exempt from breaking down. History isn't a one-way street to progress.
And that leads right to his second move.
Yeah.
The tyrannies of the 20th century offer practical, recognizable lessons. We need to see them as early warning signs.
Almost like case files from a crime scene.
Yes, not just bad memories to be forgotten.
The third move, then, is where the hope comes in. He argues that small civic habits, things that seem almost mundane, they can actually slow or even block that authoritarian drift.
Things like defending local institutions or just insisting on facts in a conversation, he sees these as a kind of crucial social friction.
And the final move brings it all home with a powerful moral conclusion.
That citizens carry a profound personal duty to act before those institutional guardrails completely fail. He constantly contrasts the silent, compliant professional with the early resistor, forcing you, the reader, to ask which one you are right now.
What I found really compelling was his focus on the psychological tricks we play on ourselves to avoid that responsibility. He calls them myths.
He's dead set on crushing them. He attacks two main conceptual myths that lull citizens into complacency. The first is what he calls the politics of inevitability.
Right, this idea that progress just happens on autopilot.
Exactly. The assumption that because we're an exceptional nation, things will just keep getting better. Snyder warns that belief just dulls our vigilance at the very moment we need it most.
And the second myth is one we see everywhere in politics today. The politics of eternity.
That's the one that romanticizes a mythic, flawless national past. A time that never really existed.
A kind of political nostalgia.
It is. And this obsession with restoring some glorious past distracts people entirely from the messy, critical job of maintaining the republic in the here and now. If you're always looking backward, you're going to miss the threats piling up right in front of you.
From a clarity standpoint, then, the book is incredibly sharp. Snyder poses his core question: how can individuals resist tyranny? With almost surgical precision. He doesn't leave the warnings in the abstract.
No. He constantly ties them to specific, concrete examples. The compromises of the Weimar Republic, the complicity of professionals in the Soviet Union. That gives the stakes a real emotional heft.
Okay, but when we map his claims to the evidence, we find a limitation.
We do. The evidence base is selective. It's not systematic. Snyder draws overwhelmingly from European cases, which is his area of expertise, Central and Eastern European history.
So that gives the analysis a lot of depth on those specific cases.
Incredible depth, but it comes at the cost of breadth. And that selectivity is exactly where critics start to push back.
Right, because by focusing only on regimes that succeeded in becoming tyrannies, He doesn't really engage with the near misses, does he?
Not really. What about the institutions that bend under intense populist pressure but didn't ultimately break? Or the strongmen who flared out after a term or two without dismantling the state?
And if he had included those counterexamples, wouldn't that give us a much better measuring stick to tell the difference between a genuine existential threat and just a disruptive political movement?
Precisely. By leaving those cases out, the book can sometimes feel like it's stuck on the highest alarm setting, making every illiberal event today look like the start of 1933.
And that leads us to the book's logic.
It relies very heavily on analogical reasoning. The pattern is always, because pattern X today looks like an early step taken by Hitler or Stalin, we have to respond with vigilance. That analogy is the book's engine.
Analogy can be powerful for illustration, but it's also vulnerable, isn't it?
Deeply vulnerable. An analogy can illuminate or it can mislead, depending entirely on how well the situations actually match up. If our current political landscape is only superficially similar to the 1930s, if our institutions or media are fundamentally different, then the analogy might just lead us to disproportionate fear.
And that is the most common criticism, right? The charge of false equivalence.
It is, that Snyder sometimes glides too quickly from "this is how 20th century tyrants behaved" to "current leaders show similar traits" without really quantifying that resemblance.
It's a real tension. To critics, that approach flattens the vast critical differences between a full-scale totalitarian project built on mass murder and total state capture and the struggles in today's democracies.
They're illiberal, yes, but they're still contested by a free press and functioning courts. Overstating that resemblance risks creating a level of fear that can, ironically, be paralyzing.
The whole book is trying to shake us out of complacency, but that panic can be counterproductive.
It can be. But before we get to the ethics of that, let's just pause for a moment. I want to reflect on his attack on that politics of inevitability, that comforting belief that democracy will just fix itself.
It's such a powerful idea because it's a kind of willful negligence. That belief is what dulls our vigilance. It gives us permission to ignore the slow erosion of norms, to tell ourselves that the worst can't happen here until it does.
And that daily choice between complacency and active engagement is central to what we explore. Our Mindful Moments YouTube channel leans right into this, offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. We try to inspire rational thought by treating those civic habits Snyder talks about, fact-checking, resisting dehumanizing talk, as daily mindfulness practices.
Moving to the ethical dimension, I think Snyder's strongest argument is his insistence on personal moral responsibility. He makes it impossible to hide.
Absolutely. His rule is simple. Don't excuse cruelty or unlawful orders by saying, everyone is doing it.
Or, I was just following orders. When we apply the golden rule, would I accept this if I were the one targeted? His guidance on scapegoating and political violence holds up perfectly.
It does. But the golden rule also exposes an ethical risk in the book's high alert framework.
What's that?
If readers become convinced they're facing proto-tyranny, they might rationalize their own disproportionate or unethical responses against their opponents, all in the name of resistance.
So the sense of imminent collapse can create an ends justify the means mindset.
It's the ultimate danger of historical analogy. A more self-critical ethics chapter could have addressed how to guard against demonizing rivals, even while resisting them. That internal check is vital.
We can also measure the book against the founding ideals of the U.S. preamble, establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, securing liberty. Snyder is basically urging readers to protect the very conditions that make those goals possible.
Rule-bound institutions, credible elections, a truthful public discourse.
And he's clear that would-be authoritarians love to use emergencies as an excuse to suspend those rights.
They argue they have to discard liberty in the name of security. So, from that constitutional view, the book is a kind of civic exam. It's asking Americans, are we still willing to shoulder the burdens of citizenship that our system requires?
But the partisanship issue remains a huge practical limitation. The book's implicit framing of recent U.S. politics, all those clear references to a certain former president even without using his name, it can really narrow its appeal.
It does, because it allows for easy dismissal. Critics point out that this slant makes it easy for readers who are already skeptical to just write the book off as a political attack, not the universal warning Snyder intended.
Which undercuts his whole message.
It completely undercuts his message that tyranny exploits tribalism on all sides of the political spectrum. A warning about constitutional danger has to rise above immediate politics to be effective.
Okay, so let's synthesize all this. Using a framework like Mortimer J. Adler's, focusing on usability, how effective is On Tyranny at actually getting people to act?
On instructional value, it scores exceptionally high. The lessons are short, concrete, and written for non-specialists. That accessibility is a huge strength. It makes it easy for any reader to ask, okay, what can I do differently this week?
And that urgency, drawn from his deep knowledge of World War II and the Cold War, it really works. You feel the moral weight of small choices, like subscribing to local news or just refusing to share an unverified claim online.
He even has that great concept of corporeal politics, the need to physically show up, not just click online. That's a strong practical takeaway.
But we have to come back to a key weakness: the lack of deep psychological analysis. The book describes how authoritarian systems work, but it offers very little insight into why populations keep falling for strongmen.
Exactly. It describes the lock-in key, but not the human desire to be locked in. It
Right.
doesn't really explore those foundational drivers: fear, identity, status anxiety, the addictive nature of information silos.
So it equips you to act, but maybe doesn't help you understand your own susceptibility to being manipulated.
That's a fair assessment.
So weighing it all, the framework, the ethics, the usability, what's the final verdict?
On Tyranny is best understood as a provocative civic manual aimed at judgment and action, not a detached scholarly monograph. It sometimes sacrifices nuance for moral urgency.
Its arguments are strongest when they stick to the well-documented mechanisms of 20th century repression.
And weaker when the contemporary analogies are just asserted instead of rigorously defended.
So the most fruitful way for you, the listener, to read this book is not as a final verdict on current politics.
But as a mirror, a starting point for critical self-examination. The takeaway should be personal reflection. What would resisting injustice look like in my profession, my community? Which of these 20 lessons am I failing to follow today? That makes it a genuinely valuable guide.
We do want to acknowledge that this critique draws on a systematic framework. It integrates critical thinking principles with an intellectual tradition that uses structured questions about argument, evidence, ethics, and logic to guide the analysis. We also applied explicit ethical heuristics, like the Golden Rule and the aims of the U.S. constitutional order, as nonpartisan touchstones.
Ultimately, the book forces you to confront the belief that democracy is a gift handed down from the past rather than a constant, shared burden that must be carried into the future.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.